Comic books are fun. They are a unique form of storytelling that allows for the bizarre imagination of writers to flow unchained onto the page with splashes of true art as its complement. And stories are wonderful. They not only help us pass the time, but process and understand our own struggles in life through conflict. On the comic book page, the idea of portraying conflict through battles of physical power has roamed as the primary setup in most stories for just over 80 years now, starting with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman, who, when many people talk about him nowadays, tend to roll their eyes in disgust or annoyance at the character. At surface value, I can very much understand why, as his problems tend to be boiled down to the fact that he's too strong or Mary Sue. And that's a very understandable reason. After all, stories are meant to reflect the struggles and conflicts of our own lives, so you can relate to the characters and thus enjoy the story. How can you relate to the character if they don't seem to experience conflict? If said character has the ability to almost effortlessly waft away their ills.
That's the knock always against Superman, that he's boring, right? Because he can do anything.
But if way too much power is the reason Superman is fading from popularity, then how come so many other popular stories have sprouted and continue to pop up about characters with just as much, if not more power than the Man of Steel? It's because the character hasn't been done justice in other media in over a decade, with no video game representation other than an evil version of himself in Injustice: Gods Among Us, and movies like Justice League, Batman vs. Superman, and Man of Steel showcasing a fundamental lack of understanding on behalf of the directors and producers of this flagship hero. They even went so far as to kill off Henry Cavill's character in just his second film appearance, and predictably resurrected him in the very next DC crossover film, which not only plays into that overpowered stereotype, but undermines the history of that character, as well as the weight death could have on another character in the franchise. All this not to mention his roles in the soap opera-esque CW shows.
You know nothing about me or them. They know more than you think.
They would want your memories of them to lift you up, not drive you to darkness. That's the truth, Clark. And the truth means everything to you. Remember who you are.
That fantasy of how good would it be to have power can easily be projected on Superman, given the iconic nature of his superpowers. Let's take a look at this scene in Man of Steel, where Kal-El learns how to fly. It is honestly done well, encapsulating excitement and scale. You watch this scene and think, I wish I could do that. It's a universal fantasy, but it's not what Superman is at his core. Superman is not a fantasy of how good would it be to have power, but rather what if someone good had power. This is why Lex Luthor is the perfect foil for the character, taking power in the form of what we view in the traditional sense, a corrupt businessman, and pitting him against our beacon of hope. That's partially the reason Clark Kent is a journalist. Not only does it allow him to get close to the corruption he may battle, but it's who the character is. Someone fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. A reporter is who Clark would be regardless of his powers, and it allows for a dynamic that forms between the awkward rookie and the determined hustler Lois Lane. We don't get that in the films anymore. We're left with stale chemistry between two people who are essentially the same stern riders. It overshadows Clark fighting for the little guy and Lois chasing the big story. The two just don't feel like a team in the recent movies. And when Warner Brothers says they don't think Superman is relevant today, I can only assume they live under a rock, not understanding the issues that our culture faces right now. We struggle to find truth in our news sources, you can't go anywhere without seeing a plea for justice, and the country faces a loss of the American way, primarily with the breakdown of family, with almost a quarter of US children living in single-parent households, the highest rate in the world. The Man of Steel is not just an outdated herald for these prominent issues, and Superman's relevancy is not tied to a singular, classic vision of the character. People can be open to a reimagining of who he is. Take for example Billy Batson, Shazam, who has been reworked from a too-good-for-this-world orphan to a confused and bitter runaway with the potential to do good. And if people truly believe that Superman is too hard to be written as a deep character, make his stories deep, and reach into the vast pool of side characters and villains at his disposal. But no matter how the character is reworked, what will never work is this scene. It's not called Action Comics just because it features action. Superman is a man of action. Clark Kent is not going to stand by and let injustice go unrecognized, just as Superman won't stand by and let someone get hurt. It's as ingrained into the character's mythos as the death of Bruce Wayne's parents is to Batman. It's why whenever Pa Kent has died, it's typically of a heart attack or a stroke, something out of Superman's control. It reinforces the idea that Superman can't solve every problem thrown at him. He can't save everyone. But he can help inspire others to be forces of good themselves. Warner Brothers seems to have the idea that Superman's identity is this perfect, flawless man, and have awkwardly tried to insert flaws to make him interesting, such as the conflict of When the World is Ready in Man of Steel. The property's identity crisis only exists because Warner Bros. And Zack Snyder made it exist. Superman is flawed, which is exemplified in his stubbornness. He has a resolve to look at an issue in his idealistic ways despite evidence to the contrary, showing a childlike expression of surprise when things aren't really that way. He looks at the world the way it should be, not as it is, and when he discovers what that means, he works to make sure things are as they should be. He far too often is prone to assumption.
That's enough. I think you got your answer.
Is what makes his interactions with the dark and critical Batman so entertaining. He is essentially a stand-in for the harsh pessimism plaguing society, and it's a fun dichotomy that mass audiences never got to truly see. Again, immense power doesn't have to be a storytelling burden. It only becomes a problem for the audience when the character's relation to that power is flat. Choosing to focus on the super rather than the man is never going to work. Justice League having Superman just defeat the big bad with no help and effortlessly fight the entire league is annoying and cheapens the roles of everyone else. Superman doesn't need to be that powerful, and it's not even very comic faithful since Wonder Woman is a more capable fighter anyway. The way Zack Snyder made these films is just so murky too. They aim for a dark atmosphere and have an ugly color palette to boot. If you read DC Comics or have ever watched the cartoons, you know that they're vivid, bright, and tonally optimistic. I mean, just look at these characters. A detractor of that could mention the Dark Knight's dreary nature, but they would forget that Batman delves into the darkness to bring light into it. It makes it all the more frustrating being a comic book fan, as the character continues to be fresh and reinvented on the page, with some of his most groundbreaking stories being produced within the last 5 years, such as Peter J. Tomasi building Clark as a family man, Dan Jurgens giving Lex Luthor the mantle of Superman, and Brian Michael Bendis exposing Clark Kent's secret identity to the world. But we'll never see anything like that on the big screen if Warner Brothers' misconception of the character continues to trickle down into their films and other media, perpetuating many people's disdain. As much as I love all comics, I do prefer the stories DC offers, and it pains me to think that DC will likely never get that apex moment of cinema Marvel had with Avengers Endgame. If I had to boil down what I was trying to say, it would be this. Superman as a character is most potent when he's a friend, when he stands behind someone's back, not just smashing things. I don't blame people who can't connect to the character if they go to see a film and just see him punch a guy through a city of civilians. A film doesn't have to be dark and miserable to be mature. Why do you think an effort is being made to lighten up these characters in the DCEU?
Philosophically, what does Superman represent to people?
A friend. And that's what people really need most. We're living in an age when people are basically afraid of contact with each other. They're afraid. People live in cities, they don't even know their neighbors. They're afraid to go out in the street, something might happen to them. Basically, technology is against you. Life is overwhelming. Even the bank doesn't know who you are. And it's like, we run around scared a lot.
When I went to the theater to see Batman vs. Superman and Justice League, I was thoroughly disappointed. But the things that stood out the most to me about these films was not what was actually shown on the screen, but what I felt in the theater. There were legitimate gasps when Doomsday punctured Superman, and I heard a round of applause from this line.
I believe in truth, but I'm also a big fan of justice.
I don't think the movies themselves were deserving of these responses, but it showed me just how relevant Superman still is to people, our cultural symbol of optimism. It makes me hopeful for a brighter Man of Tomorrow.
kryptonite bullet.
Kryptonite